Hey everyone, welcome back. Comic book collecting for me has been one of the most enjoyable and cherished uh, period of my childhood years. I remember very clearly the first comic book that I ever bought. It was at the local corner shop, sweet shop, on the bottom shelf. They used to have a whole collection of comics, DC, Marvel, Beano, Dandy, all sorts of comic books. But the first comic I ever bought was He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. I couldn't tell you what number it was, but I do remember that on the cover it had He-Man swinging a sword with Battle Cat somewhere in the distance and Orko right in the background. And I think Castle Grayskull might have been there as well. Anyway, I was a huge fan of the actual cartoon, He-Man cartoon, and so when I saw it, I had to get it. And from then on, every week, I would go down to that sweet shop and buy comics. After that initial introduction to the world of comics via He-Man, I got into DC Comics first of all, and then slowly developed a taste for Marvel Comics, and I was hooked. I was hooked. I think growing up, I was more of a fan of DC, and then I sort of progressed into Marvel more and more, and then it became sort of equal in terms of how many characters I liked from each particular comic book universe. I think DC always had a slightly stronger hold on me growing up than Marvel did. But look, to be fair, I collected both. And yeah, like I say, I have very, very fond memories of collecting these comic books. For some reason, all my memories associated with me going down to that sweet shop and buying those comic books along with relevant sweets for like 5 pence, 10 pence, 2 pence, whatever it was. All those days just seem very sunny in my memory. I'm sure there must have been winter days and rainy days, but in my mind, they were all happy, sunny, bright days. And that's the power of comic books. It and perhaps comic books of that time as well. You know, they I think they were slightly more. I wouldn't say innocent or naive. I think in the 80s when I first began collecting comic books, the comics had become somewhat the characterizations had become a little bit more sophisticated, more adult oriented. So sometimes I would read a comic book and I wouldn't necessarily fully grasp the I suppose the what the dialogue was trying to convey, but I would enjoy it nevertheless. You know, I used to love the artwork and I used to pick up a lot of facts about the world from comic books. Actually, comic books were surprisingly very well informed about the world. It just goes to show, you know, writers, I suppose, a good writer will always try to treat his audience, even if they're children, with a certain amount of intellectual respect. And these writers are pretty intelligent, and I think you can become pretty smart reading comic books. There you go. I said it. Anyhow, yeah. So my love of collecting comics began when I was a kid, and it's stuck with me even now. It you know I sometimes go to comic book sort of conventions or these large sort of comic book sales that they hold in various hotels around the country, and it's great for me to pick up back issues. I get taken back to my childhood and days of wonderment and you know sunny climes. So it's always good. But I suppose I would describe myself first and foremost as a comic book collector. Uh, and I don't think I've ever been a comic book investor. I think the reason for that is because I really like feeling comic books in my hand. I like opening them. I love smelling the paper that it's printed on, which some people might find weird, but I think if you're a diehard comic book fan, you know exactly where I'm coming from. There is something about comic book paper, and certainly the paper that it was printed on back in the 70s, 80s, 90s. There's just something about old comic book paper that is addictive. Um, I'm not an addict. I'm not saying that. That's not my sort of substitute for hardcore drugs. But I think you understand what I'm saying. And yeah, comic book collecting for me has been a friend through stressful times, and I don't think I'll ever stop doing it. I don't think I'll ever stop collecting comic books. I don't think that I could be a comic book investor. I think to invest in a comic book, sometimes you need to really look into things that you don't find interesting, or you need to treat, unless you're buying two copies of each or multiple copies of each, you need to be very, very careful. I mean, sometimes you can't even open a comic book just in case you should, crease the page, or God forbid, rip something, or some coffee spills on it. I mean, there goes your investment plans for the future. And I don't know if comic book investing holds the same charm or the same yield that it may have done in the past. I know back in the 90s, it was a very, very big thing. All my friends, well, I say all my friends, a lot of my friends who were into comic book collecting, like myself, were also into comic book investing, which I never was. But I found it fascinating. They would go to comic book stores, on a grand event when something was being released, and they would end up buying multiple copies. And sometimes they would let go of other comic books that they wanted to buy, just so they could buy multiple copies of this one book. And they would buy comic books about a character with whom they had no sort of affinity. They weren't even interested in the character, and they knew they'd never read it, but they just bought it for investment purposes. Because again, in the 90s, investment was a big thing. I can still remember a while ago, of course, obviously, when Bloodshot #1 was released, and a very good friend of mine at the time, we went down to a big, large comic store in the city, and I knew what I was going to get, and I think he had a plan to get a few other things, but then. This was an event. Bloodshot #1 was being hailed as the next big thing, and so he ended up buying multiple copies because that was the future. Whilst I bought zero copies because I had no interest in the character. I'm not saying that Bloodshot is a good character or a bad character. I just never been interested very much in the character. I remember, I think I bought something like Starman #1, Will Payton version of Starman, who I think is an amazing character. And if you gave me the choice, I would always choose Will Payton Starman over Bloodshot, even though I suppose Bloodshot, you know, people might think that's a slightly more cooler, relevant character. But for me, I knew what I wanted, right? I wanted the super fantastical, which characters like Starman, or Justice League, or whatever. That's what I was into. I was into my traditional comic book characters, even if those characters weren't as well known as these new characters coming out, and even if these characters were being bought by no one else. I knew what made me happy, and so I invested in my happiness, if that makes sense. I didn't invest in any sort of monetary gain that I might have achieved in the future. For me, it was always about what kind of character do I enjoy? What kind of comic book do I want to take home with me and read, and derive pleasure from that? Every comic book that I ever bought, I opened up and I read it straight away as soon as I got home. I never. It's not that. Look, I have a lot of uh, I have a huge collection of comic books, a lot of back issues, and in fact, I prefer to buy back issues as opposed to the newer stuff. Not that I don't buy the newer stuff, but I prefer back issues. But all my stuff is red. It's very well looked after. It has the plastic bags and the cardboard bags, but you can tell they've been read. They're what you call books that have been loved and read. And I just never saw the attraction of buying something that you weren't going to open up and read. Don't take me wrong. Um, I don't have anything against comic book investing per se. I just think it's I just think it's difficult for me to sort of come to grips with. Look, if you want to buy comic books as nothing more than a commodity, then yeah, I don't have an issue with that. Um, but you have to question whether you are then a comic book collector in the true sense of the word. I mean, do you love the comic? Do you love that comic book because of what it represents? An escape, a peek into a different world, a reminder of your childhood. Is that why you collect comics, or do you do it solely for the promise of hard cash down the road? And if it is the latter, then are you really just an investor? Can you say that you're a comic book collector if you know that you're never going to read it, you're never going to open it? Look, some comics I have bought in the past which have inadvertently turned out to be a certain form of investment. I suppose Spawn number one, when Image Comics exploded onto the scene, and they did it, they exploded, and Todd McFarlane's Spawn came out. It was a big thing. It was a big thing. I mean, I think Spawn number one is hailed as one of the biggest selling comic books of all time. Not the biggest selling comic book, but I think one of the biggest selling comic books of all time. A bit like Jim Lee's X-Men when that came out. Now I have Jim Lee's X-Men and I have Spawn number one. I have them both, but it's just a coincidence that they happen to be these collector's items. And to be fair, my uh, my versions that I've got, my copies are not in pristine condition. That they have not been, uh, you know, um, packed away, never to be opened. Not at all. My books have been read. They've been reread, and whilst they're in pretty good condition, you can tell that I'm not going to get what people might expect to get from a pristine copy. And look, that's okay, because really I don't see myself getting rid of these comic books anyway. They're, like I said, they're a part of my childhood history. Why would I do it? Why would I get rid of them? And I often wonder actually that at what point do comic book investors actually sell on their investment? I mean, I wonder how many would-be comic book investors have actually still held on to their comic books, and how many of them have actually sold them on. And if you have sold them on, how much of a profit did you actually make? I would be interested to find that out actually. Not that I would ever do it anyway, but just to see how much did your investment actually yield. But yeah, look, sometimes you get lucky and you end up buying a book that you bought for your genuine reading pleasure, and it just turns out to be a hit. But that's never been my reason for buying a comic book, and I don't think it ever will be. One crazy thing is that when Superman 75, the death of Superman, came out again in the 90s, I really wanted to get that book, but I missed out on getting it. I don't, I can't remember exactly why. I think I asked a friend of mine to get it for me, and they forgot to get it, or they kept the copy. I can't remember. Something happened, but I didn't get the copy. And that was a bit of a sad moment because even though that was considered an investment piece by a lot of people, I wasn't going to get it for the investment reason. I just really wanted to have the conclusion of that particular Doomsday storyline. But it's okay. I managed to read the story afterwards, and you know what? I was okay with it. Just to have read the story to know what the ending was, how it all transpired. The end battle was enough, and I've never felt sad at not having that. Or I never felt sad at having missed that investment opportunity. But yeah, it would have been nice to have Superman 75, an original copy, for my collection. Um, but that's okay. Um, I suppose we all know deep down inside, whether we're comic book collectors or comic book investors, can you be both? Uh, like really deep down, can you be both? I suppose you can be. I suppose you can be, but I think on the other end of the spectrum, you can just as likely get people who are just comic book collectors and would never think twice about investing. And I think you can get people who are investors generally. I mean, they might invest in records one day, they might invest in bricks the next day, And then someday they might think, oh, what else is new? And they'll think, comic books like whiskey, or I don't know, anything that's worth sort of looking into, which might have a value further down the road. I think people like that also exist, and yeah, it's good to know. It's good to know where you stand, I suppose, just so you can be real to yourself. But for me, it's all about the experience of reading that book, having it in my hand, and being transported, to a different time, a different place, a different memory, depending on which book you read. So anyway, guys, just thought I'd share that with you, and yeah, it's been interesting, just delving back into the past. Uh, Again, thank you very much for listening in, and like and subscribe if you will. If you want to comment on anything, please do. It'll be interesting to see what you guys have to say, and yeah, until the next time, take care. Bye bye.